I'm Karen Alari, and today we're going to be painting a little spring painting called Spring Walk. And here's what the finished painting looks like. We started with this reference photo, and there were a number of things I wanted to change in the reference photo, so I went ahead and did a drawing so that I could make those changes and get them settled in my mind. I changed the way the road was curving so it wasn't so straight. I made it smaller, and I just wanted to highlight for myself in that little drawing where my lightest areas were going to be, where my darkest areas are going to be, where my focal point's going to be. The focal point is obviously going to be this little flowering tree, and so I'm going to use a number of different techniques to bring our attention and the eye to that tree as the painting goes on. And we'll talk about those as we go. The first thing I'm doing here is my drawing. I'm just using Ultramarine Blue and a small round bristle brush. And this part of the painting process is just a way to give myself a roadmap for where the major parts in this painting are going. And I'm also thinking in my mind as I make this drawing, how am I going to edit and simplify this photograph? Here I'm checking the perspective lines. I have a fence that goes along the side of the road there. So I use my brush to hold it up and get a nice perspective line vanishing into the vanishing point on the horizon. You always want those two lines to recede. As they recede, they also come together, and that shows a fence receding into the distance. So I'm just thinking about these. I'm thinking about the shape of the tree because in the photograph itself, the tree had a very large trunk, and it had two big equal-sized trunks that came up, and it just didn't have a very elegant form. So as the painting process goes on, I'll be working more and more on refining the form of that tree. So I'm not necessarily slavishly following the photograph, but I'm getting a concept for the tree and then making it more fit my needs. One thing that the reference photo had was this evergreen tree that was behind the flowering tree. And I'm going to play up that dark so that I can have the light blossoms will stand out better against a more dark background. So I just established those places for myself. The large shape on the right is going to be a mid-value gray trees, the sky, the background hills on the left, the roadway, the fence, the tree. Real simple drawing. Now I'm moving on to the block-in stage. And again, I've talked about this in some of my other videos, but I follow this same kind of process more or less for every painting. And what you're focusing on in the block-in stage is getting your values correct. Values being how light or how dark an area is as compared to the other areas. So I start by putting in the lightest part of my painting, which is the sky. And I'm just using a very light blue, and I've used my ultramarine blue, my phthalo blue, and a lot of white to make this sky blue. Here I'm adding a little bit of cadmium red, a little bit of quinacridone gold to gray that color down a little bit to make my background hills. You always want to check in this process again that the difference between the value of the sky and the hill is what you want it to be. Those background hills are always lighter and bluer than you think in your mind they should be. We kind of look with our eyes and we see a green hill, but in reality, as things move back in distance, they get bluer and they get lighter. And that's what gives you the sense of distance. That's called atmospheric perspective. So now I'm darkening this down a little bit more, and I'm moving it into a gray color. I'm looking for this mid-value gray that is this bank of trees that haven't even started blooming yet on the right. And I'm thinking as I'm doing this about the fact that I'm going to be putting pink blossoms over this area. So, and the pink blossoms are warm in tone as opposed to cool in tone. The blues and greens being cool and the warmer colors being yellows and reds and oranges. So whenever you put a cool color behind a warm color, that's going to help that warm color come forward and pop out and be more dramatic. So even though these trees in the reference photo looked a pretty warm gray, I'm going over in my mind the fact that I want to keep these a cooler gray so that when I put in the blossoms, they'll pop out a little more against the gray. Moving into a shade of green here. And of course I'm mixing my greens using Ultramarine Blue, Phthalo Blue, and Cadmium Yellow Medium, and some white to give me the value I want. Just continuing to lay in this blocking phase and finding the value of this field on the left. This is a green, springy green field, but I don't want it to take precedence over the foreground, which is going to be daffodils and brighter green grasses and the pinks of the blossom. Again, I like the fact that there's that green back there though, because I'm thinking about those pink blossoms laying against the green, and that'll also help them stand out. You know, another thing I was thinking about as I was laying in the colors in this area is because this is a spring painting, I wanted to keep those pastel green and purplish blues in the background. Keep that sense of quiet, simple pastels in the painting, which I felt would add a sense of springtime, kind of Easter colors to the painting. And I wanted to keep that area in the background very quiet, without a lot of activity or detail going on, so that the painting doesn't become too busy, because I'm going to be putting a lot of separate little blossoms and separate little flowers on the ground, and sometimes that can be a problem and make your painting look like it's polka dotty. So I'm going to be trying to bear in mind the whole time that I want to keep those background areas very quiet, meaning without a lot of detail. So here I've added in a brighter green, again going over in my mind that this foreground area of the green is going to be brighter, and you can see how it got a little grayer and a little less bright as it recedes back into the distance. You always want to look for, what you're looking for is kind of the average value of each of these areas that you're blocking in. So there's going to be lighter parts and darker parts of these areas, but you're just trying to simplify it as far as you can in your mind. And these darker areas I'm laying in are the shadow, where the shadow of the tree is coming across the grass. Now I'm laying in that background evergreen tree. And in the reference photo, as I was saying, it wasn't as dark, but I really wanted to play up the darkness of it so that I can bring out my light blossoms and they'll really pop against it. Because actually in the reference photo, it was almost a little hard to see the blossoms. The values were all pretty close, and so they didn't stand out as much as I knew I wanted them to in this painting. I darkened that green by using Pthalo Blue and Alizarin Crimson, which give you a nice dark. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know I make my darkest dark with Pthalo Blue, Alizarin Crimson, and Quinacridone Gold. Makes a nice, deep, transparent dark. And I can push it to a warm dark by adding more alizarin, or cooler by adding more phthalo. So I'm thinking about these shadows, and even though I know this isn't going to be the exact color, especially as the shadow moves over the roadway, it'll be a different color than it was over the grass. But I'm trying to establish in my mind, how dark do I want these shadows? How much of a contrast do I want between the shadow and the grass? And you'll see as I move on later in the composition, I actually rethink that initial block-in, because again, this is a spring morning and I want to keep the colors lighter and higher key. We call that a higher key painting when the colors in general are lighter. And I feel like if I can keep those shadows lighter, that's going to give them more of a feeling of the gentle spring morning sunlight, as opposed to the kind of sunlight you get in the middle of summer where your contrast would be real strong. But at this point, I'm using this process to figure that out. So that's the benefit of doing a block-in, is you can work through these issues in the painting in your mind. I'd gone back and forth in my mind also whether or not I wanted this fence there, but I decided that it helped to lead the eye to that tree. And also I knew I was going to have a little bit of a problem because I was putting my focal point basically in the front of this painting. And so I'm going to need some pretty big momentum to keep people going down that road and not just stop and look at the flowers and blossoms and then stop looking at the painting. So fortunately I have this road, which is a very strong compositional element that brings your eye backwards into the middle of the painting so you can come around again. You always want to lead the viewer's eye. And then this fence too will create that momentum moving backwards. And then I'm going to play up that little light space at the end of the road. Everybody likes a light at the end of the tunnel, right? It's something that's going to have a higher contrast area, and it's almost a secondary focal point. It's something that will bring the viewer's eye all the way back into the painting. And just continuing to establish those shadows and think about the shadows and getting close to the end of the block-in. I just kind of loosely sketched in on the right where I'm going to have some tree trunks to counterbalance our tree on the left, our focal point tree. I just want to make sure I remember that I'm going to have some real vertical elements there that are going to balance that tree and keep there from being too much weight on the left. Reestablish that light area in the light at the end of the tunnel there, reminding myself that I want to keep that visible. I'm just playing here a little bit with what direction I'm going to go with these shadows. How big are the shadows going to be? But close to the end of this block-in area, though as I said, there's a couple things that I do change. One is how dark I went with those shadows. And secondly, that hillside or the field on the left is actually dropping away off of the picture plane. And you don't really want things to drop off the picture plane. You want the hill to rise up a little bit there on the corner and bring your eye back in so your eye isn't let off the edge of the page. So I'm just taking a look at it and deciding what else I think this needs. And I'm reestablishing a light sky area. I didn't want that trees to go straight across like that. I wanted them to dip down in, which also draws the eye backwards. So that's the end of part 1 of our 6-part series. Hope you can join me for the rest of Spring Walk.